On behalf of the New Mexico History Museum's Friends of History, greetings and welcome to the September edition of the First Wednesday Lecture Series. I am your host, Ben Woodbury. Today's online presentation will be The French in New Mexico, 4 Centuries of Exploration, Adventure, and Influence. Our speaker is Monsieur Francois-Marie Patorni. Before we get started, I just want to say the lecture today is being streamed on the History Museum's YouTube and Facebook pages. I would like to thank the museum for providing the Friends of History access to these online platforms and for the essential technical support of Chris Albert and Kathleen Dull of the museum staff. Immediately following this presentation, there will be a live question and answer period with the speaker. The session will only be available on the museum's Facebook page. The link to this session will appear immediately following the presentation. During the session, questions and comments for the speaker can be posted on the museum's Facebook page chat room. Questions posted during the lecture on either web page also will be shared with the speaker. Following the conclusion of today's lecture, the full video of the presentation and the Q&A session will be posted on both the History Museum's Facebook and YouTube pages for viewing by any and all. Now to the presentation. As I mentioned, our speaker is Monsieur Francois-Marie Patorni, a French-American. He is an independent scholar specializing in the history of the French-speaking people in New Mexico and the American Southwest. After a career at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., he moved to New Mexico in 2004, where he was struck by the extraordinarily rich history of the French, French Canadians, and other French-speaking people in our state. He therefore set out to document that history as a contribution to their cultural resurrection. His book, The French in New Mexico, 4 Centuries of Exploration, Adventure, and Influence, was published in April of this year. In his talk, after introducing his great search for the French in New Mexico, Monsieur Patorni will highlight the lives of a few of the most influential, unusual, or colorful French individuals through their stories of love and death, of chases and hunts, of successes and failures. This rich history will be illustrated by images rarely seen before. Enjoy the presentation, and we will see you at its conclusion for the live question and answer session on the History Museum's Facebook page. Monsieur Patorni.
Thank you for coming to my talk. I am Francois-Marie Patorni, and I am going to tell you a few stories of the history of New Mexico as seen through French eyes and the history of the French presence during the last about 400 years. But first, I would like to start with a personal story. When I came to New Mexico from Washington, D.C. about 14 years ago, I was told there are 3 cultural groups in New Mexico: the Hispanos, the Native Americans, and the Anglos. There were no French here, and you are an Anglo, because you are not a Native American and you are not a Hispanic. So you are an Anglo. That's what they told me. Well, if one looks at a map of the United States, you see on this map about 1/3 of the United States in blue was at one time or the other managed or controlled by the French. You can see all these French town names on the map. And you can see New Mexico at the edge of it, so it's not surprising that there might be at least a few French speakers in New Mexico at some time. Well, I came, and one of the first things I saw was a French church in the middle of Santa Fe. Totally out of place. French church, like a big village church. And I was told it was built by French Bishop Lemmy, Jean-Baptiste Lemmy or Lemmy. That was quite interesting. I went into the church, and if you look at these slides, on the left you have the Cathedral of Clermont-Ferrand, where the bishop was from, and on the right you have the Santa Fe Church Cathedral. So it looked very familiar, very strange. Then I went out, turned towards the Loretto Chapel, and I saw the chapel to the left here, which I was told was designed by the architect who was in charge before of renovating the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, in the Ile de la Cité in Paris. So he was given instructions to model the Loretto similar to the Sainte-Chapelle, although it's not as elaborate. And in the Loretto Chapel, the vitrals were imported from France. The statue of Notre-Dame de Lourdes on top of the chapel was imported from France. The harmonium, the little organ, was imported from France. Well, anyway, so I thought it was all about the church. And you see on this picture of group pictures of priests, those who, with the label on their chest, are French priests. So I thought it was about the church, and okay. I continued to walk. I walked along towards the plaza, and then here is murder scene number one. Murder scene number one. This is the Exchange Hotel. That was the best hotel in Santa Fe. Now it's replaced by La Fonda, who was built on top of the site. And this is where, in front of this hotel, or in the lobby, we don't know really, the nephew of Bishop Lemmy, John Lemmy Jr., he was not a priest, he was married to Mercedes Chavez, a very prominent family of New Mexico, and John Lemmy, the nephew, murdered Francois Mallet, who was the architect for the cathedral, a nice Frenchman, who had been hired by Bishop Lemmy. So there was a rumor that Francois Mallet had an affair with the wife of John, and John got upset, and he shot Francois in the neck. Francois dropped dead. John was arrested, put on trial, was declared insane at the time of the murder, but just at the time of the murder, so he did not stay long in jail. And that was the end of the story. French story. So I continued my walk, and I ended up in front of the monument of the end of the Santa Fe Trail, this granite piece of stone. And on the other side, near where this Galleria Plaza, on the plaza, it's a shopping mall, there was the cafe of the Mercure brothers. They were French-Canadian brothers, traders, worked a lot with Kit Carson's and everybody else in town. And they had a cafe, and there in the cafe, François Xavier Aubry, a very famous young man nicknamed the Skimmer of the Plains. He was doing the shortest rides between St. Louis and Santa Fe. Anyway, they got into an argument with somebody about the layout of the railways. There was a misunderstanding. There was a brawl. Aubry got stabbed and died. And there were about 2,000 people at his funeral. He was very well admired and respected. So I crossed the plaza, went to the Palace of the Governors, walked in. And there on the left, there was this print, which is a reprint from Harper's Magazine, which shows a cafe. The cafe with gamblers and people who drink and French people. It says on the legend, Frenchmen drinking. Okay, that was quite interesting. So I decided to learn a bit more about it, and I embarked on my great chase for the French in New Mexico. And what I found was amazing. I found nearly 1,000 names, French names, of French in New Mexico who lived there or were very active here. I got in touch with about 300 descendants of these people, and I found hundreds of facts and stories. Many of them were truly amazing. But we don't have that much time, maybe 35 minutes. So what I would like to do is just to walk through the history of the French in New Mexico, seen with French eyes and French characters. And then we would pause to dwell on a few amazing facts along the story. So this is the story. It starts in 1539 and ends today. And these are a few milestones, not all of them. And I just flag a few of the amazing ones. Well, the first European who set foot in New Mexico, is what is now New Mexico, was a Frenchman. Marc de Nice, he worked with the Spaniards, so he became Marcos de Nissa. And he was posted in Mexico and embarked on a trip to find out the marvelous, legendary cities, 7 cities of Cibola. So he went north, crossed the border of what is now between Mexico and Arizona, and he ended up in what is Zuni Pueblo now. Zuni Pueblo. And it's an amazing story. There have been books written about it. And he thought the Zuni Pueblo was as big as Mexico City in those days, that the buildings were marvelous, they were emeralds and people wearing silk robes and everything marvelous. So he went back because it was a dangerous place. He reported, and that gave rise to the expedition of Coronado. A long story, a marvelous story of adventure, life and death. Another group of people who are the really founders of New Mexico is 3 young men. Jacques Grolet, who became Santiago Gurule. You heard about the Gurule in New Mexico. Jean l'Archevêque, who is known as Juan Arquebeque, founder of the Arquebeque dynasty. And Pierre Meunier, not much known because it does not seem he had children and he's vanished from history after a few years. They came first to Texas with the Salle Expedition. It was an expedition to claim the Mississippi Valley for King Louis XIV, Louis XIV of France. Long story. It was led by Cavalier de La Salle, a great gentleman, explorer. La Salle got murdered by his men, and 3 of his men, Grolet, Arquebec, and Meunier, after all kinds of stories and happenings, ended up living with Native Americans in Texas, and after a few years decided to surrender themselves, give away themselves to the Spaniards because they could not stand it anymore, although they had become very famous with the tribes. And they wrote a letter, which we still have. It's written on a parchment with a picture of a boat, their boat, and you can see the boat. And on each side of this document, written in French by each of them, Archevêque and Grolet, they say basically, we have enough of this life and we surrender ourselves to the Spaniards, and this is it. So they were taken, interrogated, taken to Mexico City, jailed, then taken to Spain, jailed, and then the relationships between the French and the Spaniards were better. So they decided to release them because they hadn't done nothing wrong, actually. But they could not be sent back to France because they knew too much about Mexico, New Mexico. So they were sent back to Mexico. And there they joined the De Vargas expedition to settle New Mexico and ended up there. So they founded the 2 dynasties we know very well now, Gurule and Arquebeque. And I would like to pause a moment about the life of Juan Arquebeque, Jean l'Archevêque, because a few days ago, on August 20th, was the 300 years anniversary of his death. He was there, I think, in his 50s, and he was a prominent man, and he was working as an interpreter to an expedition 800 miles away from Santa Fe to check of possible invasions by French and others. And here on this picture, it's Segesser Hide. It's called the Segesser Hide. It's a painting on the hide, huge painting in the Palace of the Governors. And that portion of the hide shows French soldiers with their muskets and their hats. So they were the invaders. And there was a battle, and practically everybody from the New Mexico team was killed, including Jean l'Archevêque on August 20, 1720, 300 years ago. So let's have a thought for him. Other amazing men of great power and influence were Charles de Croix, Carlos de Croix, you see him on the top picture, and Deodoro de Croix on the lower picture. They were two Frenchmen from the city of Lille in the north of France, very French, but working for the Spaniards. Carlos de Croix, believe it or not, was the viceroy of Spain in Mexico. And Deodoro was his nephew, who became the commander general of what was called the interior provinces, the area you see on yellow in the map. So they were the most two powerful men of the area, and they are credited for reforms, but also for bringing the taste of good French wines and French cooking, and they had French cooks and all that to New Mexico. So, amazingly, two Frenchmen leading basically the area. Another giant of exploration is Pierre Vedrovial, again working for the Spaniards, Frenchman from Lyon in the middle of France, and he really pioneered. He was very charismatic. He was nicknamed Manitou, one of the most charismatic people. He knew all the Indian tribes, and he was working for the Spaniards, exploring the area, and he pioneered the trails to and from Santa Fe, between Texas and Santa Fe, and between St. Louis and Santa Fe. So he's the true pioneer of the Santa Fe Trail. Another group of amazing Frenchmen were the fur traders and fur trappers. And they would often stop at Benn's Fort in Colorado, near New Mexico. This is Benn's Fort, and it's really worth going there. Actually, when I went there, it's rebuilt the way it was, with people enacting who was there in the 19th century. And one would speak French at Benn's Fort. So I came in the little store with people looking like 200 years ago or 150 years ago, walked in and spoke French to bluff them. Well, I was amazed. They answered in French, not very good French, but they spoke French. That was amazing. Anyway, here you have a photo of Seran Sandra, who was a partner in building the fort, very prominent man. And too long to tell the story of the French in the forts, but all the forts were very French in a way. Just to give you an idea, you don't have to go through this list, but these are French and French-Canadian fur traders and trappers known to have lived or worked or both in New Mexico. So it's not surprising that the beaver and the buffalo went almost extinct. They just went and killed everybody. So fur trade was big. French on the Santa Fe Trail was also a big thing. On the Santa Fe Trail, but also on the other trails leading to Santa Fe, the Southern Trail, the Camino Real, the Spanish Trail, and all these trails. And this is a plaque of the Shuto Society which talks about the Santa Fe Trail, and if this plaque, if you go there and read it in details, it points out that the true pioneers of the Santa Fe Trail were these French explorers. And this is why French, or kind of French, was spoken on the trail. And these are a few expressions I picked up in various diaries and memoirs. Now, this is not a course on practicing French, so you don't need to read them all. But I'll flag one I love very much. It's this one. It's the gage d'amour. That means the token of love, or the proof of love, of the commitment to love. And it was a leather pouch made by the ladies of the life, the dear ladies of these trappers, so that they would remember them on the trail and while hunting and trapping. So it was a pouch where they could put their pipe and the tobacco. And this is, of course, a French trapper with the gage d'amour, the proof of love given by his lady, who, of course, was, like most of them, Native Americans' wives. Well, I would like to say a few words about the people of influence. There were many people, French people in New Mexico. Many were artisans, workers, barbers, doctors, carpenters, masons, all of that. But some had very big influence, and one group was the church. We've met Bishop Lemmy, but the first 5 bishops were French. And you can see these plaques on the right. That's in the Santa Fe Cathedral. The first 5 bishops were French. And most of them were for the French region of Auvergne in France, where Bishop Lemmy was. So they knew each other. And they were recruiting a lot of priests. And I want to show you what happened in New Mexico in the Catholic Church. So in these few slides, there are three areas of the slide to concentrate on. One are the dots. The red dots are French priests. 1 dot is 1 priest on these counties of New Mexico. The blue dots are New Mexican priests, and the black dots are other priests. There were some from Mexico, Holland, Germany, Poland, etc. So you look at the dots, especially the red dots, you count them, and you look at the corner, 1852, that's the year. And we're going to go through the years. So get ready and look at the red dots and the year, 1852, a few. Remember, Bishop Lemmy started around 1852. So, 1852, 1860, more red dots, 1870, 1880, more priest, 1890, still more priest, 1900, 1910. So by and then that stopped because of World War I. But by 1890, 90% of the Catholic priests were French, and most of them from Auvergne. So of course they did good things. There were some bad apples and some great ones, but they were very influential because New Mexico is a Catholic state, so they were spent time fighting the Protestants, converting Native Americans, building churches, and so on. Another group of very influential men, because they were men in those days, were the politicians. Very few people in Santa Fe remember that the first 2 mayors were French, mayors of Santa Fe. I'm not running, but the first 2 mayors were French. The Robidoux brothers, Antoine Robidoux first, and then his brother Louis. So you have their pictures on this slide. And on the left is a carving in Utah where Antoine Robidoux carved on the stone that he has been there, like many others. Other politicians, a very famous one is Tranquilino Labadi, of French descent. He is a descendant of Domingo Labadi, a French Basque, so it's a very prominent family. We cannot go through all his credentials because there are many. But just look at the slide. These are the influencers in politics, politicians, elected officials at all levels in New Mexico. So these are the politicians. There were also a few very rich people, the Tycoons. One was Lucien Bonaparte Maxwell. His mother was French, and his second name was Bonaparte, like Napoleon Bonaparte, because they were admirers of Bonaparte's. And he got a land grant of almost 2 million acres. You can see on this map the Maxwell grant, so he was a very prominent person. But he was not the only one. You can see other French land grants. You can see the Nolan family. They're probably watching me. Hello. And the Beaubien, Saint-Vrain, etc. And there was Elena Gallegos' grant. Elena Gallegos was the wife of Jacques Gouroulet, who died before her. And she inherited, and her grant was practically all what is Albuquerque nowadays. And others, Bishop Lemmy had a grant, Pigeon of Pigeon Ranch had a grant, and so on. So they were tycoons. There were also tycoons. There were also tycoons in the south of New Mexico, Mesilla, which was kind of supporting the Confederates. They were a bit ambivalent. But Auguste Morin, this is his house. It's the first brick house of New Mexico, built by a brick maker, Jean Junest, also French. And he was very rich. He died, he was murdered because he had hidden his gold in a hole, in a vertical hole and in his floor. I tried to find the hole, but it's now covered by wood floor. And it's a house which spelled bad news for many people. Many people were murdered in that house. But Auguste Morin had a collection of classical paintings which has vanished. That's interesting. He was well off. Anyway, then what happens is the 1870s saw an influx of French business people in Santa Fe, but mostly Albuquerque and the Rio Grande Valley. And why did French people come in the 1870s? Well, what happened in the 1870s was pretty awful. First, there was the invasion of Mexico by Emperor Napoleon III. And he brought, complicated story, but he brought 40,000 troops to invade Mexico. He appointed an emperor of Mexico, Maximilien, who was quite a progressive and good man, but he was not from there. So he ended up executed. And you see the famous painting of his execution on the upper left. That was the end of Maximilien. So the whole thing was a disaster. The French troops were sent back to France on many boats, but some stayed behind. Quite a few stayed in Mexico, married, founded families, and a few found their way to New Mexico. I found 5 families, and this is an example, the one on the lower right. He was El Frances Girard, and this photo was given to me by his descendants. Thank you so much, and you can see it. Joseph Girard, the guy sitting down with a beard, who ended up in northern New Mexico. He has been traced playing poker with famous people and so on. And on the left is an interesting picture too. It's the French in those days had their own version of America's manifest destiny. It was called the French Civilizing Mission. The idea was that the French had to civilize Africa and other countries. North Africa, tropical Africa and all that. It was to justify basically colonization. So after all these disasters, and then the war with Prussia, France was at war with Prussia. The Prussians won. They had the siege of Paris. People ate the animals in the zoo, the elephants, the giraffes, the zebras, the dogs, the cats, the rats. And then that was followed. So France surrounded, and there was civil war. Many people got killed, economic recession. So it was really bad in France. So people migrated for their civilizing mission and finding better lives. So most of them went to North Africa. But some of them had heard about New Mexico because of Bishop Lemmy and all these priests they would write back home and from Auvergne. So quite a few people, instead of going to North Africa, through word of mouth, ended up in New Mexico, quite a long way in those days. And they were acting in most areas of business. On the trade, on the trails, on the fur trade, although it was very dwindling at the time, almost inexistent. In agriculture, livestock, shops, building contractors, artisans, mining, a lot in mining, making money, hotels and so on. And on the right, you can see a few of the names of these business people, but there are many more, many more all over New Mexico. From Farmington to Las Cruces, all over. But many worked south of Albuquerque on agriculture. And of course, agriculture, the wine industry. So there were lots of pioneers in the wine industry. I have a whole chapter on the wine industry in the book. Too big a subject to deal here fully with. But these are names of a few French families and people who were prominent in the wine industry. There were other smaller ones, but these are some of the main ones. And so we can remember a few of them, those marked here, and I'll just show you a few family pictures that they gave me. This is the Tendre family from Isleta. So these are family pictures. These are the Lermuseau and Mallet families, and they would intermarry, which was a big difference. After the 1870s, the French families would intermarry. Before that, there were so few French. Actually, there were many, but there were few at the same time, and they were all men. So they would marry with Native Americans and with Hispanic families because the language was similar, the culture was similar, and so it was a difference. Now they would intermarry within French families. And you have the more families, the Allary, the Debout, the Leplat families. Now, for the last few words, I would like to talk about modern times, but remember that French-American friendship is the oldest friendship between America, the United States, and the rest of the world. Of course, you remember Lafayette, the Louisiana Purchase, where Napoleon basically gave away America to the Americans. The Siege of Paris, where the American ambassador was an amazing man and really was practically the only foreigner to help. The Statue of Liberty, which was a gift from France. And of course, World War I and World War II, when America saved the French. So just a few words on the world wars. World War I, on the left-hand picture on the top, is Charles de Bremont, French-Swiss, and he was a military leader. He fought in France. Actually, he got gassed and died from being gassed on the battlefield when he came back to New Mexico. Very prominent man in Roswell, in southern New Mexico. And the stamp you see below his picture is a fundraising stamp from Albuquerque. And to learn more, you just go to Santa Fe Military Museum. It's a great place. It has been all refurbished. They do a lot of great education programs now in the memory and understanding of those who have served in the army. On World War II, you know, of course, that America saved Europe. And to thank them, the French put together a whole fleet of rail cars. You see one here, which is on the fairgrounds in Albuquerque. They were rail cars normally used to carry soldiers, and mules and horses. So they filled these rail cars with gifts, all kinds of gifts. Musical instruments, toys, pictures, anything you can imagine. To thank the American families. There was one rail car per state, more or less. And if you go to the municipal library in Socorro, there is a glass display under a painting of Léon Trousset, another Frenchman who painted, this is in all the museums in New Mexico. Anyway, in the glass cage, you have a few of the gifts. And the one shows here is a little doll, you see, and there is a label which gives the name and address of people who sent the doll. And they say, thanking you for the good meal for our one-year-old daughter. So there was the name and the address. So I Googled it. And I find the little girl, the one-year-old girl, who is in her 70s, like all of us. And she's doing well. And I got pictures from her family, and it was a great experience. And now finally, to the present times, you would have not think that the French are going to the planet Mars with the Americans of New Mexico, but they are. There is a project in Los Alamos, a whole team, to design equipment to be on the rover to the planet Mars. It's called Chemcam, and it's a machine which beams a laser beam to rocks, makes them into vapor, and analyze them through spectrographs or machines like that to find out what they're made of. And half of the team is French and is based in Toulouse. There were, maybe still are, a few Frenchmen in Los Alamos, but that's a story. So there is a lot written piecemeal on Frenchmen biographies in New Mexico. These are a few of the books, not all of them. This is an example. But I want to share a couple of memories which were dear to my heart, the uplifting experience from that search for the French in New Mexico. One is connecting with people and the descendants. This is a picture of the family reunion of the Ledoux family a few years ago near Las Vegas. They were about 100 people. There were also searches for mystery stories, and one is the search for a painting of Napoleon, which was given to a retreating commander during the Civil War. After the Battle of Glorieta, they were moving back to Texas. And I have been in touch with the descendants of the main characters of the story, of this painting of Napoleon, which cannot be found anywhere, but it could very well be the same painting, which is now in the Museum of Napoleon, the Malmaison Museum near Paris, because its origin is a bit murky. So that's a whole amazing story. Then there was stories of surprises. For instance, there are many stories in the books of Bishop Lemmy preaching under a rainy roof and holding his umbrella and to protect himself, or preaching under the umbrella. Well, I found the umbrella here. It is on the left. It's an umbrella with an ivory handle with his name on it, which was actually sold to me by a quite well-known person in Santa Fe, whose mother was a friend of a grandmother of a friend of Bishop Lemmy, some story like this. There were also fun stories. A few years ago, I was on my way back from Yellowstone during the amazing winter a few years ago. It was very cold winter. And it was February, and I stopped at the St. James Hotel, built by Frenchman Henri Lambert. And the hotel has a reputation of being haunted. And below you see the picture of the ghost of Marie Lambert, the wife of Henri Lambert. And they say that she comes in sometimes. And when she comes in the room 17, you smell a lemony smell and she appears. So I booked the room 17, left the window open, and it was so cold. And I started speaking French, thinking it would entice the ghost to come and talk to me. And I indeed smelled the lemony smell. Wow. So I looked around, and it turned out that the smell was the smell of the furniture polish on the dresser under the window. Maybe lemon pledge or something like that. So I did not see the ghost. Well, that's just snapshots of my story. It's all in the book. There is a lot of additional information on my website, FrenchInNewMexico.com, FrenchInNewMexico.com. You have my contact them, and I am happy to share all my notes with descendants and researchers. I have a lot of stuff which is not in the book, and I share absolutely freely everything. So I thank you for coming, and happy reading of history books through the winter. Thank you. Bye.